I don't know if you can hear me. If you're in the comments section, go and throw a thumbs up for me. Today is maybe an interesting day. Hold on. So, yeah, there. I won't be responding to a lot of comments today. I'll review them at the end. I have a lot of ground to cover, and today's podcast is more of a academic uh, lecture of a few things I want to review that often get brought up. Many of you know that I'm in my grad program, and this podcast is a foundation on my research for my thesis. And yeah, research for my thesis project, and a major theme that gets a major theme in my work is exploring the concept of culture as an ever-evolving institution. It has layers, and it is not solely contingent upon ethnicity. However, assimilation is necessary for the creation of new culture. And through my course of studies, I was made aware of a concept that the cultural paradox of preservation of culture while living it and thereby creating something new. I was also introduced by this concept through the reading of the manifesto Yu Yu Hawk, the way of the human being. It was written by Harold Napoleon some years ago, and Harold Napoleon, who was an Alaskan Native man, who came to his enlightenment while in prison. I will be covering a few more of his concepts from the manifesto later on. Should I actually work? Just do this. But you can find his book online. I'll make reference to it later, and yeah, it'll be in show notes. Yeah. So, anyways, the subject that constantly gets brought up in the podcast is this issue about several identities a previously colonized ethnic person must juggle. Those being national, economic, generational, immigration status, regional, and the AM part, whether it's Phil-Am or whatnot. It gets confusing, it's complicated, and for a younger person who's trying to, and desperate even, to define who they often are faced with the who am I and am I good enough? Moreover, an effect of that complex situation sometimes is a strong resentment toward the familial culture bearers, racism within their own ethnic community, and a misguided and misplaced anger toward and the fear of a colonizer. And that negatively affect gets worse if those colonizers, the non-ethnic people who have the indigenous cultural knowledge that young ethnic person is desperately trying to connect to. This is where the terms like cultural appropriation gets flung around and accurately and out of fear, anger, and resentment. I will go into detail about this messy subject later on, but another thing about this, another result of that messy situation, and another part, obviously, in my thesis project is researching positive healing modalities for previously colonized ethnic peoples who are trying to reconnect with their pre-colonial ethnic traditions, culture, and whatnot. I mean, for example, FMA is one of those modalities, and as is the learning of Babayan, it's the traditional language script, traditional tattooing practices, and all the indigenous ethnocentric clothing out there, like stuff from Nostalgia Inc., Bayani Art, Itak Clothing, and of course the explosion of flip hop. I mean, Talilo Marfil, Ruby Ibarra, Moro Beats. I mean, those are all great examples of this cultural resurgence and hunger that young people within our community are using as a means to reconnect, reclaim, heal. And of course, like there's comic books and like the Ashwang Project, which I've referenced a lot on this podcast. There's so much out there, and it's wonderful. So with all that, these excellent examples of revitalization, they are great examples of what we call the living in the present and creating something new part of that cultural paradox and a form of cultural reclamation and revitalization. So here is a graphic, let me pull it up, of what I'm talking about when it comes to the cultural revitalization. Here we are. And of course, this is just something I pulled off the internet. You can Google form it. And it sucks. Anyways, you can find that online. It's there, it's available, and just Google cultural reclamation and revitalization. One sec here to answer the thing. So, like I said, for everybody, this is going to be more of a lecture today and less of a. It's less of a it's less of an actual two-way conversation because I don't have a guest. So, anyways, let me drop this back down. Anyways, like I said, the cultural reclamation part and reconnection are a way to process and are a process of healing the wounds of generational trauma and the epigenetics brought on by colonization. And the indigenous cultural suppression part and the perceived denial of the future that was free from outside cultural influences. Yes, I agree. That last bit is a tricky thing to wrap your head around and to navigate. And again, like I said, cultural practices, the reclamation, the reconnection, is part of this process of healing those wounds of generational trauma and the epigenetics brought on by colonization and the indigenous cultural suppression and the perceived denial of a future that was free from the outside cultural influences. What that basically means is the what if the Philippines was never conquered? We don't know because obviously the Philippines was conquered and colonized, and here we are in 2025 talking about this stuff. So, moving on. Jose Rizal once wrote, this is Jose Rizal, a Filipino philosopher, writer, statesman. He wrote, while a people preserves its language, it preserves the marks of its liberty. And I connect that liberty and language part as, say, the education of one's culture and history can free one from the limited victim mindset, the crab pot mentality, and the misplaced anger and resentment brought on by generational trauma of colonization and the lack of positive mentorship to move beyond all that pain. So, who is all this research and this program development for? For one, it's for me and my children. I am one of those disconnected, displaced Filipinos who was born in the Philippines but adopted by white Americans and raised in the States. I was not taught my ethnic culture, my language, anything. I was literally whitewashed. And how could I not have been? My adoptive parents are white, middle-class, military people from Southern California. And here, let me show you a picture of my parents. It's relevant. Actually, see? And that's me, a month old. And so, yeah, how can these people teach me how to be Filipino? They can't. And on top of all that, here's another one. Here's my family. I mean, we are a multi-ethnic mess, and it's a beautiful mess. And these are 3 out of my 6 siblings. So again, my 2 wonderful adoptive parents, it is not their fault that they could not teach me the things that I so desperately yearn for to be a better Filipino, let alone be Filipino at all. But as a young man, that's on them, I suppose. But how could it be? It's literally impossible for them to have taught me what it was to be Filipino. but that can only go so far. And I'll go into that in more detail later. Anyways, um, fun fact about my adoption is I was born in a brothel, and I have never met my biological parents, but I have connected with several extended biological family members. And I mean, some of you are on here on Facebook anyways. Actually, two people like Sachi, it's a distant cousin. Anyways, my biological mother was from Olongapo, and my biological father was in Olongapo. Anyways, about my childhood. My childhood was a chaotic mess. I mean, that household was pure chaos because I grew up in a multi-ethnic mess, like I said before. My adopted parents were foster parents, and when they retired from foster care, they had something like over 100 plus foster kids come through our home. And I could not, and I could do a whole podcast on that alone, but I will save that for later. I mean, if anybody's interested, I'm more than happy to explore that space. Okay, and here's the other part. Another problem for adoptees is this whole idea of being washed by their adoptive parents. Um, it is often that not intentional. I mean, this idea of color blindness, for example, is one of those unintentional bad ideas. Um, but again, it just happens because how can these parents of adoptees of another ethnic type teach the full breadth of of the cultural nuances of the ethnic culture of their adopted child? This is an example of the disconnect, or it's the starting point of that disconnect from, or in some perceived notions, the denial of the ethnic culture that many experience because of adoption. Again, sometimes it's deliberate, and that's awful. That just is. But more often, it's an inadvertent thing out of the control of the parents. Again, it's not the fault of the parents that they have no opportunity to use their way to teach an adopted child how to be of their ethnic background if they are not of that ethnic background and raised in that culture. Again, how could my parents, my adoptive parents, as awesome and loving as they are, how could they have taught me to be Filipino? The answer is they couldn't. So, furthermore, one of the examples of this issue about the denial or the disconnect is in a very practical sense. If there are no Filipino families in the community, then how could I have participated in Filipino gatherings? Moreover, if those Filipino families that happen to be in the community refuse and are unwilling to socialize with me, it's the same result, albeit that resentment I talked about previously and will freely discuss that that's works. Again, that's the whole like, why am I not enough mentality? And I'm not the only Filipino adoptee that's gone through this, because many have gone through this. Many are still going through this. And my heart goes out to you. Thus, the impetus behind this podcast and my research and what I'm trying to do with my degree field. Again, moving forward and connecting. So, and when I talk about the not having Filipino families available to me, yeah, that was my lived-in experience. And just the same, having Filipino families in the community unwilling to connect with me and to socialize with me, I've had that as well. And both are awful. And I should say the one is unfortunate and the other one is just awful. But again, I can't be in control of people's willingness to interact with me or not. It can be a big ask, and I acknowledge that. Now, I want to introduce a term to you that I've been using in my academic writing to describe the subculture of disconnected and socially displaced Filipinos. I call this group, of which I am a part of, let me pull up the graphic here. I call them FDIM. Now, that's FD.I.DM. That stands for Filipino Diaspora Indigipino Decolonization Movement or mindset. Yeah, it's a long, convoluted, complicated, but it's, again, I like acronyms, or whatever. But the topic is also complicated, complex, and convoluted. So, uh, in addition to that, there is also the decolonize your mind mentality or movement that's directly tied to this community. I mean, it's a major centerpiece and feature of the community, the Filipino Diaspora, Indigipino decolonization, or just simply FIDM. So, in the case of the FIDM, let me drop that back down. In the case of the FIDM, they are the children of immigrants sometimes, and sometimes they're the children of immigrants who are disconnected from the culture of ethnic origin because, say, they're second generation. They were raised outside of the Philippines and they were raised abroad. Or, like me, they're adoptees. Or, I mean, just in general, this is the PhilCam. These are those of us whose parents or grandparents immigrated to the States and whatever point assimilated and did teach their children. So this creates a circumstance that the FIDM can have a strong resentment toward their cultural bearers within their family unit who often did not or refused to or just didn't teach them the cultural practices such as language, customs, and history because they were so dedicated, their parents, the original immigrants, they were so dedicated in assimilating into their new nation and creating a new cultural identity. And this is where you get things like the indebtedness to your new nation state, the nation that brought you in, that gave you immigration, all these things. Retired Major Alex Fabos Jr., professor, actually talks about this all the time in a number of other podcasts and papers. So, but back to that. Again, these children tend to resent the culture bearers for not teaching them. They are also resentful of the culture that they have assimilated into, and which that is a tricky space to explore because it's one thing to be upset about your parents for not teaching you this, that, and the other. It's another thing to be resentful of the place that you live in, even though you live there. So I don't understand that quite fully, and yeah, it's odd. Anyways, lost my train of thought here. So I'm going to bring this graphic back up for people to understand. Again, the FIDM stands for Filipino Diaspora Indigipino Decolonization Movement. Anyways, so let's go back to that. These children resent the culture bearers for not teaching them. I've experienced this with my own students, my own like PhilAm students, that their parents didn't teach them to speak and they want to learn and they're just confused. So that layer of frustration is something that I have not experienced because I don't have my biological parents and family group present to have had the opportunity to teach me, but chose not to. So for those who have gone through that process, again, my heart goes out to you. I understand to a point to that, but that has not been my lived-in experience. The other side of that, which is similar in vein, is that I had adoptive parents who were incapable of teaching me the language. Yes, I'm somewhat resentful of it, but it's misplaced because at some point I have to take it upon myself, especially as an adult, to go seek that knowledge and to learn those things. So, and that's what I've done, and that's what I'm doing. Anyways, again, going back to the whole thing about these children resenting not being taught and being resentful for the place that they have assimilated into, these kids, and I've been there, they feel like they've never truly belonged, that they're not exactly American, not exactly Filipino. So what am I? And I can see this circumstance potentially brewing, and actually I have seen this in my own eyes with my own children. But it's it creates a circumstance of being caught in between or being not enough. What's interesting and a bit of a paradox is that they are privileged enough that those who are aware of that they're not enough, that they're caught in between. They're privileged enough because they have access to Western education to learn that their indigenous ancestors were conquered and colonized. I mean, thus the phrase, I didn't realize I was poor and oppressed until you told me I was. This is very Burkean, like very radicalized, liberal minded, like radical liberals that we love to pick on to a point. But still, again, this Burkean mentality is incredibly limiting and tends to encourage the crap pot mentality. It definitely encourages that radical kill the colonizer mentality, which I understand, but I don't agree with fully. I understand the anger, but it's the messaging and the process of going through that. It's incomplete. Anyways, there is a balance between being educated about history of the colonial oppression and generational trauma for the sake of healing and advocacy versus being radicalized and being resentful and racist. All right. I find that age, experience, and guided mentorship by either peer or traditional mentors who have gone through this entire process and come out the other side of it enlightened and have found positive ways to proceed and focus all that pain into something productive. Again, turning pain into passion and then peace. However, that does not mean one forgets, but one can forgive and move forward. And also, one can prepare so that we can break the cycle of generational trauma and create something new and beautiful. I will be talking a lot about this today. Let's drop that graphic back down. So, back to the FIDM. Back to the FIDM. What's interesting about them, and again, for me, they do not identify or participate in institutions that have led to the conquest of their land and destruction of their indigenous culture and ethnic origin. For example, a major one is not participating in the Catholic Church or any other forms of Christianity. When I spoke with Talilo Marfil, the flip hop ambassador and rapper, some time ago, I asked him, because this is a tricky subject, but it's actually pretty straightforward. I asked him, what is a Filipino and the Philippines without the Catholic Church? And the answer is pretty straightforward. There would not be a nation called the Philippines. Thus, there would not be Filipinos. Thus, there would not be this current question that is present. Because it wouldn't necessarily mean that the Philippines would have been conquered and colonized by Spain and the Catholic Church and in the name of King Philip. And this is the part where you have to know your history to understand that, to understand where things have been or the things that have occurred. You have to understand the concerns of the present so you can move forward. But when you get stuck in the pain of the past and are unwilling to move forward, that is on you. And I get it. I've been there. And I know many are still there. And thus, this is the purpose behind, again, things like this podcast, things like what I'm trying to do with my research and this program that I'm doing with my academic background. So going back to this whole issue that the FIDM that willfully choose not to identify or participate in institutions of colonialism, this is where you see the rejection of colonial institutions, that these disconnected children of the diaspora seek those traditions, rituals, and activities prior to colonization. Again, this is where you see a new culture emerge. It's a hybrid culture, balancing between the cherry-picked elements and features of the indigenous pre-colonial ethnic culture while living in the present reality of the current national allegiance and citizenship. Again, they're creating new culture, one that is uniquely beautiful and often
is a driving force for education and reform. Again, the precarious balance that all previously assimilated indigenous cultures must navigate is the dance between practically preserving cultural knowledge and activities while living in the present circumstance of national allegiance and modernity, and thereby creating a new culture. I'm going to keep coming back to that, a new culture. FMA, for example, you have the preservation of the art in its original form by the progenitors. That's where curriculum is really important, or purists. But you also have these innovators, the people who interpret and create new and have modern nuances and spin based upon what's currently occurring. And you're constantly dancing between the two. So again, preserve, live, create. It's a beautiful process that we all should embrace. So with that, within that process, there's a tremendous opportunity for rediscovery, creation, and healing. This is what I'm talking about, like the creating of new culture. You have the opportunity to heal the pains of the past, especially if those who seek reconnection to their culture are willing to go do the work and find those sources of education and take it upon themselves to actually take in the knowledge and face the hard things about their culture and their circumstance. Again, to heal, to move forward, you have to face adversity and do the hard work. So, the risk of the FIDM is in the process of their revitalization of cultural indigenous practices, some of them become highly militant, and others, and on the other side, which is the thing that I prefer and what I'm trying to do, is practice radical compassion to break the generational trauma of colonization and disconnect. But again, that comes from age, experience, education, and a lot of fucking therapy. And I am one of those that have and is going through this process. This is so that my children, like any other good parent, so that my children don't have to do it the hard way like I am. Again, each generation should get better, but that requires one generation to take the initiative, to have the courage, the bravery to face the difficulties of navigating this complex cultural conundrum. Get some coffee real quick. Just catching up for those who are following today's podcast. Again, this is really not so much about, this is really not a two-way dialogue, obviously, because I don't have a guest today. I didn't ask for one, and I have had a lot of things on my mind here recently, especially finishing off this school year and diving into some pretty heavy content in dealing with the ethnic studies of my degree. Because this stuff is relevant. I'm trying to figure this out for myself, and I know others have come before me. And like, I want to make a couple of acknowledgments of some of my mentors who have helped guided me through this. I mean, for example, Elric Jundis has been a wonderful sounding board for me to bounce ideas off of academically. Because this is what he has done academically and professionally, is dealing with ethnic studies and concerns of culture. And of course, like people like Paulo is really important, because without him, I really wouldn't have the idea to do podcasts like this. And of course, he also helps me set the tone and, again, give me an opportunity to bounce ideas off of them. And of course, most of all, my instructor and my instructors, Belton Lubas and Datu Kelly Warden, because with them, I've had to navigate a few things here recently, and they've given me some really good insights to approach this in the way that I'm going to do it today. So yeah, like I said, for those catching up, this is more of an academic lecture rather than a two-way dialogue, because again, the guest of today is me, myself, and I. So hopefully you're enjoying this. So yeah, back to this whole thing about the paradox of culture. So here's a quote from Harold Napoleon's manifesto, Yu Hawk, the way of the human being. Actually, let me pull up this book, because this book is phenomenal. Let me talk about this book real quick. Yu Hawk. Here we are. Pages. Yeah, let me show you this book. This book's pretty cool. For those who haven't taken a Native American or Alaska Native Studies course, I highly recommend it because so much of our history, so much of our education is really dictated based upon the educational system of those who control the schools, and often, I hate to say it's whitewashed. It really is. So the academics in charge, the academics who are the leading bodies of education, tend to control the narrative and negatively in the past. But currently, there is a lot of options and opportunity to seek the other side of knowledge. And this is where, again, having writings by academic sources that are of the ethnic indigenous background in particular. So, again, where is this book? Images. Yeah, here we are. Reset. Share screen. And I don't know if you can see that, but that's the book I'm talking about. So it's called Yu Yu Hawk, The Way of the Human Being. Again, I'll have it in the show notes. So, anyways, this quote, actually back to the reasons why to learn this stuff, is there's a lot of radicalization in the writings of people addressing decolonization, addressing civil rights, addressing all these concerns of the other half of the story of being colonized and conquered. And again, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, and I get it. I really get it. And a lot of it is well deserved. And that's where you get these issues, though, of like the commentary about institutional racism. And you see like the counter swing from where you have, again, cultural suppression and racism. And then you have the other side, which is like the counter swing, because as things happen, you have an action reaction. The counter swing is the people who are so forcing this information and telling you that you should feel sorry because you did this, you evil colonizer, and they end up being like the oppressive regime they themselves. Again, this is where you see, to be political, the swing back and forth between affirmative action to colorblindness to DEI, then to the removal of DEI. It just goes back and forth, and we got to find the middle ground. And the middle ground is the smaller section, and honestly, as it takes time to get there. And again, time and education and experience to find that enlightenment, to find the middle ground. And this is where things like this quote from Harold Napoleon's Yu Yu Hawk, the Way of the Human Being, is so relevant. And it reads as this: "It is time we bury the old culture, mourn those who died with it, mourn with those who survived it. It is time we buried our many dead who have died in the long night of suffering, then go forward, lost no more. We have been wandering in a daze for the last 100 years, rocked by the succession of traumatic changes and inundations. Now, we have to stop. Look at ourselves as the new Alaska Natives, or Indigenous peoples across the board, period. We are, press on together, not alone, free of the past that haunted and disabled us, free of the ghosts that haunted our hearts, free to become what we were intended to be by God or the Creator." So, a core belief in Napoleon's messaging is the acceptance and acknowledgement of both parties, colonized and colonizer, that the great death of colonization, yes, it occurred. Moreover, both parties must be educated on the subject from both points of view to prevent it from happening again. Again, never again. The never again part, whether it is the genocide of the Jews, never again about the conquest of indigenous peoples, never again. And that comes from the study of history and the acknowledgement of social issues particular to the history. People don't want to hear it, but people don't want to do hard things or difficult things because it requires them to face some difficult realities, breakdowns of some prejudices, some ignorance, and some bias, and face the difficult so they become stronger. Again, resiliency comes as a result of facing adversity, suffering, getting stronger, doing the work, and moving forward. So, how is this practically done to heal all those wounds of colonization, for example? It can be summed up as cultural reclamation and revitalization. You see great examples of that within the Black community and Indigenous American communities. The Filipinos, you are also seeing a lot of that. Obviously, because this is a FMA podcast, you definitely see that. So, like this, and it's not a new thing, and it's never going away, and it shouldn't, because the antithesis of cultural suppression and cultural genocide is reclamation and revitalization. Now, another author and historian, Native American historian, Nick Estes, talks about this idea of the internationalism of indigenous peoples and the plight and feeling and that brotherhood, sisterhood of what it's like to be a colonized person. But this universal connection is important so we can all understand it. The problem that I find with writings like his is, yes, it kind of boils down to this like Marxist class-based nonsense, but we can be so much more. And this is where like hybrid mixed families actually does that, where you have two people who are ethnically not tied, who have two different cultures, clearly, can learn and work together and create that bond. But on top of all that, where both people actually are able to celebrate their ethnic cultural traditions together and not have one overplay the other. So that's something to think about. And again, previously colonized peoples feel this universal connection and process to return in part to what was, but they end up becoming something new, which is the opportunity of becoming something new and beautiful and amazing. And you see this a lot. And again, FMA is a great example. It's a great platform, a medium to do that. So, and again, I've talked about that. Like the FIDM is where you see the explosion of art, music, flip hop, traditional tattooing, cultural clothing, all the things that I love bringing up in this podcast, and will continue to bring up because we should be celebrating that. And we should be celebrating those who have carried the knowledge, regardless of the source. So, and I'll talk more about that later on. So, and again, to have all this stuff to revitalize the culture. And again, you can find the definition on Google. I have a graphic, but apparently it sucks, but I'll have it available later. But yeah, it requires those people to seek out knowledge and to be educated on all those things. Actually, the cool thing you see, like even with my own artwork, actually, I know this with any Filipino artist who does Filipino art, centric artwork like Itak Clothing, Bayani Arts, Bayani the Realist, Nostalgia Inc., all these people who do Filipino-centric art, whether it's mythology or whatnot, they have to research the mythology, have to research the cultural nuances, and in the process of doing that, they learn about it, which is great. And this is how you keep the stories and the culture alive. So, and again, it requires those who want the knowledge to seek the knowledge so they can learn the knowledge and teach it. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes the academic sources, those cultural bearers, are not ethnically tied to the subject matter. And this is where an inaccurate accusation of cultural appropriation may come about. And again, it comes from a place of misplaced anger and resentment toward their ethnically tied and often familial cultural bearers. However, and I'm going to use this phrase and I've had this phrase be a problem, is however, it is not the fault of those non-ethically tied cultural knowledge bearers having that knowledge that you, the FIDM, do not have. Also, it is not the fault of the FIDM that you were not taught the knowledge you seek. However, that excuse, I was not taught, therefore I'm angry, can only go for so long. If you have the opportunity, the courage, and the passion to seek this knowledge, then seek it. You must take the responsibility for your own education, enlightenment, and liberty. Remember the quote I read from Jose Rizal, while people preserves its language, it preserves its marks of liberty. Again, it applies here. The knowledge is there. Seek it wherever it is and be free from your pain. And here, recently, this phrase I used was misunderstood twice after explaining it twice in detail, and they fixated on the not your fault part, but conveniently left out the other half of that phrase and the contextual use. So here we are. The full phrase I use often as a learning point is, it is not the fault that the non-ethnic FMA instructor has his knowledge while you, FD.I.DM, the ethnic Filipino, does not and was not taught these things. This statement is used as a reframe to change and challenge the individuals, the FD.I.D's perspective, navigating their ethnic multicultural crisis. Again, misunderstood. So let me explain it again. It's not your fault the non-ethnic Filipino FMA instructor has the knowledge while you, the ethnic Filipino, does not and was not taught these things. This is a statement used to reframe, to change and challenge that individual, that FD.I.D.M, their perspective while they navigate through their ethnic multicultural identity crisis. It's not an accusation. It's not an insult. It is not a statement of cultural appropriation. It's none of those things. What it is, it's a learning point for that young ethnic individual to say, hey, regardless of the source, be grateful that it's there and check your privilege, your anger, and your resentment, and actually just move forward. Again, when you hear me use that phrase, it's not an accusation. Actually, the real risk is that these sources of information could have entirely disappeared. They could have been stamped out and suppressed as part of the process of cultural destruction by way of conquest and forced assimilation. In fact, the phrase in question reminds one, the FD.I.D.M, to be grateful, again, be grateful that this information is available regardless of the ethnic source. Thus, the positive work and impact that Western non-ethnic Filipinos should be celebrated and is acknowledged with profound gratitude. The positive work that they've done to elevate and move forward our beloved martial arts culture is in fact and in point without the Westerners, Americans, Canadians, etc., FMA in its current form and prominence would not exist. Period. I mean, point in case. I mean, story time. My adoptive grandfather, I've talked about this in the past. My adoptive grandfather was a World War II Marine that somewhere in the Pacific picked up a Filipino-esque edged weapon system. We think he may have picked it up in Hawaii when he was going through the jungle warfare school there, where it so happens the Rebro system was being taught. I don't know. I have not made the academic research to make sure that is actually verified, but it makes sense by timeline. Now, caveat to that is my adoptive grandfather brought back this knife killing system to the family, taught it to the family, did not pass on the cultural features, because how could he, because he did not learn them. And it wasn't until, so I was doing FMA all this time but unknowing that FMA even existed. And it wasn't until a Filipino martial arts instructor, as a guest instructor at a Kyokudo school, so a Korean martial arts school, saw me doing the things and said, oh, you're doing FMA. And I had no idea what it was. So again, without the West, there would be no introduction to it. So keep that in mind when one has to put in perspective. So again, our non-ethnic Filipino brethren who are the cultural bearers of our beloved FMA, I salute you. I love you. Thank you for the work that you have done. So again, let me take a break here. All right. Anyways, again, when you hear that phrase from me, all right, it's not an accusation of cultural appropriation. It's not an accusation of, it's not an accusation of exploitating, and it certainly is not an insult. So, which leads to another point about cultural appropriation versus appreciation. I have a couple of charts that I have used in academia, and there's some better ones out there, of course, but I will bring up one that I use often, and it's been a place of controversy, I suppose. But one second, let me grab it here. Here we are. So this chart right here, I didn't create this, but like I said, I use this chart all the time for academia, and this is a chart that got used or misunderstood in a recent exchange with another individual, which I'll talk about here later on. One of the things I would add to this is this section about do I have privilege? No, do I have privilege or not? Actually, even before that, this third bubble here. No, am I making money? Am I using it because it adds value? I would clarify in there is, am I doing the thing and exploiting it and not giving credit or account or acknowledgement of it? That I find is actually the real problem when you're addressing the accusation of and the misusage of cultural features and leading to cultural appropriation. Another graphic that I would recommend is, here's this one. And this one's a little more in depth. And I can make this available later in the show notes. And there is another one here. Where'd it go? And here's another one. Again, you can Google these things. You can find them. There's some great ones out there. Again, the blue one is the one that I have used, and it's the one that gets called into question sometimes and has in a recent exchange. Anyways, moving forward. I lost my train of thought. So here's the thing about cultural appropriation to also consider and to critically think about is you need to address first, what is it? You have to find the definition of it. And let me read you the definition. And again, you can Google this stuff and find out and look it up yourself. But in short, cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation are distinct concepts related to the interaction between cultures. Appropriation involves taking elements of a culture without understanding or respecting its history, while appreciation involves learning, understanding, and respecting a culture. Appreciation fosters cross-cultural understanding, while appropriation can be harmful and exploitative. It's that last bit. Exploitative, willfully, knowingly exploiting the culture. That is the big part. That's like the key identifier that I find. And again, you can find this definition, just Google it. So, back to my thoughts here. So, and again, when you're addressing cultural appropriation, when you're being accused or accusing, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. Is you need to consider the source of both the accuser and the accusee. All right. As the accused, you need to identify who they are and what they are doing and why they are doing it. Okay. As for the accuser, same thing. Who are they? What are they doing? And why? Moreover, you also need to figure out where this is coming from. Is it coming from a place of anger, privilege, and radicalization? Or is this actually a true learning moment or even an actual check on a person where that accusation is actually justified and factual? So, again, for the accused, something to think about, and actually just for both, something to think about is, again, being exploitative. Are you exploiting the thing? Meaning, are you not giving credit, gratitude, being academically or professionally honest about what you're doing? Or you're just doing this for your own gain, self-serving, without any real thought of consequence? The other one too is I look at, are they patronizing or belittling the marginalized ethnic group of where this cultural practice, feature, or artifact comes from? Are you is the accused of being culturally appropriating. Are they telling the marginalized ethnic cultural group how to be a better version of that? That's messy. Okay. The other one I look at, so basically what it is, to use the phrase of "don't tell me about my culture, bro." It's a joke. It's used jokingly, but it's still factual. Like when you have somebody not ethnically tied lecturing you, an ethnically tied person, how to be a better ethnically tied person. So again, you have a white guy telling a Filipino how to be a better Filipino when that white guy is not a Filipino. That's where the perception comes, and that's where some of the problem comes. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, another problem I run into with the accused is the ally problem. Okay, one can educate about the culture, but they must not speak on behalf or as a member of the marginalized ethnic group. This is like the whole like concerned liberal person being upset on behalf of that individual. That marginalized ethnic individual can stand up for themselves. They don't need you to intercede, especially if they're adults. If they're children, that's a different story. But as an adult, to an adult checking on another adult, don't rob them of that opportunity to educate and have resilience. Again, advocacy is different than identifying as and speaking on behalf. Again, you can be offended on behalf. Again, being offended on behalf, it can be problematic. It is just the other side of this coin, this complex coin. But one can be offended by the incident, but mustn't be offended on behalf and rob that individual person who's being culturally exploited the opportunity to, again, have that moment of resiliency, education, and learning. Okay. Also, okay, this has been a lot of shit. It's a lot of preamble. So after all that, why am I doing this podcast today? Twofold. These subjects get brought up all the time in this podcast. And I wanted to take an opportunity to give an in-depth breakdown of these concepts and social issues because they're going to keep being brought up in the podcast. And we're going to continue to navigate this because, like I said, it's a big part of my academic research. Let's see. Second, I have been made aware of that my words that were discussed in private, and this is really frustrating, that my words that were discussed in private are being deliberately misused, misinterpreted, and I'm being mischaracterized for the sake of content creation. Okay. Let me set the record straight. About a month ago, Chris Chu, my good friend Chris Chu, and I had a podcast, and yes, we were talking about certain social media characters and their marketing strategies. Without dropping his name, of course, we're talking about Tim Hartman. This isn't a new thing, and it's been an ongoing thing between Tim Hartman and Chris Chu for quite a while. Where this comes into prominence is because Chris and I were discussing this jokingly on the podcast. Now, yes, we took a few jabs at his online persona and his approach, but they have never been personal attacks on his character. And I never crossed that line. We never crossed that line by personally attacking him and his character. And on top of all that, I'll take my responsibility on my part for offending and making offense. Okay, I'll do that. Yes, sometimes I open my mouth and put my foot in it. Sometimes I voice my opinions that I shouldn't. And honestly, there's always people out there that don't like what I have to say. And that's fine. I make it a point to make sure that everything that I say is culturally relevant, authentic, factually correct, all these things coming from a place of brutal honesty and genuine truth. Okay. So, like I said, I'll take my own part. I will take my own accountability if I offended Tim. Right. So, on top of all that, what we have brought, other people have brought up their displeasure in Tim's marketing strategy on the show. I mean, for example, like my whole podcast with Mark Medieros, when Tim started doing all these videos of antagonizing the BJJ community. And yeah, there's a lot of people that got heated about it. They didn't understand that it was an inside thing between him and the other guy. But point being is, at a surface level, there was a lot of people that got upset with that. And I was made aware of it actually through other BJJ practitioners. So again, Chris and I aren't the only people who have commented on the podcast about that. Other people have. So it just so happens that it was here as of recent that this occurred. Now, and again, you can look up the podcast of both Mark's and my conversation about this, and obviously Chris. It's all out there for you to consume. So as a result of that podcast that Chris and I had a month ago, Tim sent a joint message between Chris and I, and he was mainly addressing Chris. It just so happened that the conversation, of course, occurred on my show. Tim, of course, was asking for clarification, and he was upset about a few points brought up, which is totally fair. And again, I will own that, but we were not attacking his character. We were voicing our opinions of his video marketing strategy. And of course, I was unable to fully respond to him that night because it was late on my end. And so I told him I'd give him a call the next morning. So the next day, I had a private 2-hour video call with him, and Tim and I covered a lot of ground in that conversation. Again, I apologized for my part. He and I worked through some stuff. He asked why I don't like his videos, and so you all know, I don't like videos that are intentionally antagonistic, that put down other martial arts and other artists, where the intention is to generate content from fake beefs between the participants, especially if they're in on it. That I don't like that. Humor is one thing. Obviously, I use humor, thus the rubber chicken. But picking fights or looking like you're picking fights on social media just to get views, I don't like it. So again, the rule that I live by when it comes to being conscious and mindful of whatever content I put out there is that, am I being educational? Am I being inspirational? Or am I being artistic? Again, and that artistic aspect is entertaining. Okay. Educational, inspirational, entertaining. Those are my criteria. I know others don't live by that, others don't follow by that, but that's just my criteria. And that's also the lens that I look through when I view content. Is this stuff, it doesn't make me feel good? Does it help me learn something? Or does this entertain me? So there's that. Let me get some coffee. And so again, talking about the things I don't like, particular to social media or like certain videos and video formats, I told Tim as such that, again, utilizing that whole matrix of which I define, put out content and view content, I explained that to him. I explained to him what I dislike. And again, this is a 2-hour conversation that was private, is videoed. It was a video call, but it was not recorded. So there's stuff in there that we're remembering a month later in discussion, which I thought we had been done with, but clearly we're not. So there's things being missed, obviously, because there was no record to go to. So, but for my part, because I don't flat out tell you to fuck right off in the conversation, I don't fucking like you, this, that, and the other, because that's not my way, especially if I'm trying to be a professional, which I am. I don't talk that way if I'm trying to problem solve through something. It serves me no purpose. That's emotional, and it's not what I want to do. And on top of all that, again, how am I supposed to voice my opinion if you're not going to listen to me whilst I'm cussing you out? There's a difference between candid and blunt and direct versus just being abusive in the conversation. So, again, with Tim, I told him I don't like his content. I don't like his video work. I don't like it, especially as of late, because it's annoying. I don't like the format. I don't like the style. I just don't like it. And that's fine. That's my opinion. As like a lot of people don't like my stuff. They don't like the funny voiceover. They don't like the rubber chicken. That's fine. You're allowed to have your opinion on it. And if you ask the question as to why you don't like it, and be prepared for the answer, and you may not like it. So, and that thus the case we're here. I also made a comment about using accurate historical photos that are, and again, that's a small academic critique. And I also told him that I don't like reaction videos, like the ones where one martial artist reacts to another martial arts video without actually addressing the context of their video. I don't like stuff like that. And I made that known. Also, in that 2-hour conversation, I took the opportunity in good faith and out of fellowship and professional courtesy as a peer with good intention to address and educate Tim, and he calls it a lecture, whatever. That's fine. You can perceive it, but I gave her a critique or made Tim aware of that he should be aware of some of the potentially offensive things that he has said and the perceptions that people have regarding some of his candor, like the whole take the F out of FMA. I mean, I understand what he's saying. I mean, he's explained it multiple times. I understand what he's saying. I don't agree with it, but there are a lot of people out there within the FIDM, the Filipino Diaspora, Indigipino, Decolonization Movement mindset, etc., that are way more culturally sensitive and often militant and radicalized, and they view anyone like what he has sometimes done and said as offensive. And I made him aware of that kind of thing. Again, I wasn't antagonistic about it. Again, I wasn't insulting him. I just, as a, hey, bro, by the way, are you aware of this kind of thing and what you do? And it's a positive critique. So, thus, it led into this whole misunderstanding about concerning cultural appropriation. And let me be clear, I did not accuse him of cultural appropriation. I did not accuse him of culturally appropriating Filipino culture. He, however, interpreted that I did, and he interpreted that I accused him, and of which I did not. He asked a question, however, and I gave him forthright, genuine, and candid answers. And apparently he didn't like or understand my answers, my answers in general. And that's on him. Despite all that, I thought our conversation was positive. Again, I was polite, I was straightforward, and I was forthright, but I was polite. I thought our conversation was positive, although with some, like I said, some very candid discussion. But we did end the conversation amicably, and it was a 2-hour private conversation. And I thought we had sorted it out as adults. I apologized for my candor and the things that I had said to him. But yeah, again, so after that conversation that we ended, like I said, I thought we ended well. I thought we had a good understanding of each other. He then, the next day, he messaged me asking for more clarification about the phrase, "It's not your fault." And I gave him a full write-up. Sorry, I'm still trying to get over this cold. Again, I gave him a full write-up of what that phrase means. It's not your fault. And with the full detail and the full quote. And I've already talked about it often in this podcast, and I can go back to it. But again, apparently he misunderstood the nuances and the explanation. And again, it's a write-up. I have it available to pick apart and read, and I've also have it again, and I will continue going through this concept throughout this podcast. So you can figure it out with me. Now, here's the other part that's problematic about what occurred during this exchange between Tim and I. He decided to make a whole podcast about it, which you can make podcasts about you want. I mean, I'm doing the same fucking thing right now. But that podcast with Dean and Ty was about cultural appropriation. And I was totally unaware of this because, one, I'm living my life. But it wasn't until a student sent it to me. And what I come to find out in this podcast, he, without dropping my name, but made some serious references to me and my podcast and to the conversations we had been having, which I thought we had worked through and figured out. he suggested that I'm a racist. And again, Tim Hartman suggested that I'm a racist. That's deeply frustrating. Okay. The part of the conversation that he misrepresented and thereby insinuated that I may be a racist is when I said that regarding the misplaced resentment, I was there at one point in my life, but no longer. It is a process we all go through. And he left out that last part. It's a process we, the community in question, the FIDM, all go through. And in my case, I have gone through a lot of work to process my own resentment and misplaced anger. I stand on the other side of it where I can address it healthily and positively wherever possible, and I will. Thus, this podcast and the academic focus to develop programs to mentor the angry, resentful young FIDM through this process to turn pain into purpose, passion, and thereby finding peace. And I am not the only FIDM that has and is going through this process. So he does not acknowledge my growth and the opportunity I took to reform and to move forward. It's almost like saying you are only just whatever, because you're one of them at one point in your life, and therefore that's all you're going to be. Honestly, that's so small-minded, and it's icky. Also, after watching that podcast, I sent a joint message between him, so Tim, Dean, and Ty, addressing the misrepresentation and the twisting of my words by the omission of the context and full statement, and thereby the mischaracterization of my persona. Tim never responded in earnest. He did make another podcast, however, and referenced me again without name dropping, but making a lot of references to me and my podcast, stated that I am mentally unwell. He is wrong in its interpretation of me and my character. He is incorrect, and it's uncalled for and highly offensive. For one, I am not a racist. Full fucking stop. To suggest that I am, fuck right off. What he does not know, aside from he does not know me, we've only had a couple of interactions, one of which was the longest interaction that we had was a 2-hour private conversation a month ago. Okay. What he does not know is that my wife is white. Our children are mixed. My adoptive parents are white. I have an adoptive brother who is black. The rest of my adoptive siblings are white. My adoptive cousins are Samoan. And I grew up in with foster kids from several ethnicities and cultures. And on top of all that, my best friend, oldest friend in the world, Charles, who my son carries his name, is a big black man with a Vietnamese partner. So, like, to say, like, my reference, and I hate to use qualifiers like this because I shouldn't have to put out there that I'm not this. My work should speak for itself. And this would come from if you actually knew who I am and actually interacted with me and actually have the time and presence to sit there and think and listen and actually learn my story and not just go through that filter of you're already picking a fight. That's wrong. Okay. Tim's so fucking off base about this subject. And so here we are. Okay. If he wants to talk about racism, here we go. I have actually fought white supremacists. There have been several times that I have faced overt and passive-aggressive racism. I mean, comments toward my wife, my children, because my children are mixed, because we are a blended family, okay? That we're not real Filipinos because we don't speak Tagalog or Ilonggo. And that's from other Filipinos. So let's wrap that shit around the situation here. We don't want to talk about racism. The most overt and awful racism that I've ever faced comes from other Filipinos. Think about that. And I'm not the only one who has dealt with this. Thus, the not enough discussions here. Okay. On top of all that, having lived in Texas, Nebraska, and all over the South, where comments were made and some straight on aggression was targeted at my wife, my children, and because we're a mixed family, we survived that. For fuck's sake, we went through Harrison. We went through the KKK town where the headquarters of the KKK was in Arkansas a couple years ago, and that experience was we inadvertently went through and we didn't realize, but that experience was life changing for our family. That's a story for another time. But again, racism. If you want to talk about racism, growing up, I've gotten into so many fights because, again, my parents, my sisters, and two of my brothers are white, and my middle brother is black. And I had to defend against small-minded people who are so offended at the idea of my mixed family that they initiate violent contact. Fuck, I deal with this shit all the time in my little ass town of 5,000 people here in Homer, Alaska. And guess what? It mainly comes from white people. It's typically the old and the rich, obviously rednecks from the boonies, Magars, so like the Maga people, and worst of the bunch is the liberally minded people on my behalf tell me how oppressed I am, but in the same, they say, it's okay, you're just a poor whatever. The worst part is I had a Filipino woman that I've known for years, whose children are also mixed, belittle my wife and in front of our children, saying that they're not real Filipinos because they're mixed. That fucking hurts. So again, if you want to talk about racism, Tim, if you want to talk about racism, there's a part of my story that you do not understand, sir, and you are incorrect. All right. And on top of all that, what makes this also more obnoxious in this whole situation, thus this latter half of the podcast, is I did not want to have to dive into the suggestion. You made the suggestion about the status of my mental health. All right. If any of you know me, my story, etc., I mean, I've talked about it a lot on this podcast, and I'm free to talk about it and willing to talk about it if you have questions. You know where I'm at my point in my life and what I am doing to be that man. I am blessed and I am grateful to have survived and taken the opportunity to become, despite everything that has occurred in my life, by my hand and by me and the person I am today. Yes, I am in recovery. I'm a veteran. I'm an adoptee whose biological mother who was a prostitute, where adoption is the first and only trauma an adoptee survives and must be grateful for. And I have never have had the opportunity and probably will never have the opportunity to meet my biological parents. I am a survivor of incredible violence that I participated in and was subject to by the way of war, criminality, sexual assault by a family member, and I have been homeless. You all know I've had suicide attempts, that I have PTS, but I am no longer in crisis. And without all that trauma, I would not be here today as the man that I am. The process of my post-traumatic growth has been the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life because it has forced me to really address who I was, am, and trying to become. I get to live with the ghost of my past, that angry young man stuck in crisis. And I get to say, I love you, dude. Put down the sword. I got you. And without you, I would not be here today. However, I had the bravery to unfuck myself and be responsible for my own life and liberty so that I would no longer be negatively that I would no longer negatively affect those who are around me, those whom I love, by my actions, by hand, and my candor. Thus, how I am and will choose to be every day is brutally honest, but accountable. If I ever say anything you disagree with, the audience or anybody in my circle, anybody in my little world, send me a message in good faith, and I'll have a conversation with you, and we'll figure it out. It's on you what you do with it. Anyways, I did not want to do this podcast today. However, I'm not going to let someone insinuate that I'm a racist or mentally unwell for the sake of content creation. I actually apologized to Tim in that 2-hour private conversation, that 2-hour video call. I actually celebrated and praised his work and effort for the FMA community. I did that again in follow-up conversations. I took responsibility, but he decided, Tim, you decided to take a private conversation public, which I believe was in good faith, and decided to twist my words and misrepresent me. Just know I don't appreciate being misrepresented and intentionally misquoted, especially for something so fucking small and unimportant as content creation. I really didn't want to do this today, but this is what I'm doing to let it go. If you have the bravery to say it out loud, be brutally honest and genuine, you can work through it. And in all of our other exchanges these past few weeks, I thought we had worked through it all, but apparently not, and that's on you, sir. And as I said in our last exchange, which I will share with everyone, is that I will continue to interact with you positively and professionally because that's what I want to do. We have had 2 interactions on social media, Tim. We don't know each other personally. However, when we spoke, you asked questions. I gave you honest, forthright critiques as a peer. Yes, they were passionate. Yes, but they were respectful and professional. They at no point were personal attacks. And again, I had no intention of blasting you on social media. However, here we are. Despite me not wanting to waste this energy, time, and intellectual effort addressing this thing further, I would like to continue to professionally maintain a dialogue that's positive with you. Again, as I said in our 2-hour private conversation, if you feel the need to ask for clarification or check me on my candor, do so. Communicate with me, and I am receptive and can adjust. But when you misrepresent me, misquote me, and insinuate awful things, when you know that's not the truth from the conversation that we had in good faith, you're wrong, sir. And again, I'm going to leave it at that. I want to set the record straight for my part on my end, since the content of a 2-hour conversation, which was not recorded, which was about a month ago, thus the misremembering part and only fixating on the parts that you didn't like, are being used publicly and initiated by you, Tim. I have the written conversation available for review if needs be. Again, private conversation, not recorded. So, what's up with that? And again, moving on, because I want to move on and past Tim, I want to put in the record of his error. And thus, this part of this podcast. I try to be a man of peace, and I try to be a man of goodness. And yeah, there's certain things I will not let slide. And again, this is that today. Anyways, I've covered a lot of ground today. And if anything you take away is consider the social issues of the FIDM. I mean, have a bit of grace and compassion and patience for them as they navigate through the identity crisis and trauma of colonization and where they fit and belong in this world. And also for our FIDM. Be grateful that the cultural information and knowledge you are desperate to learn and reconnect to is available, despite the source. And again, the source, if that source is factual, intellectually honest, historically accurate, and accredited, and not exploitative, embrace them. And don't get hung up on the minutia of the fact that they're not ethnically tied to the culture. Again, the limiting small mindset of prejudice and racism goes on both fucking sides of the equation here. So yeah, check your privilege there, FIDM. All right. Now, here is the other part you have to acknowledge. It would be a tremendous tragedy is that our culture could disappear entirely because there was no one left to teach it. And especially if those who wanted the knowledge couldn't get past that knowledge may have come from a non-ethically tied source. That's so dumb. If you're willing to let our culture die because you're so hung up on the race aspect, that's so dumb, small-minded, and wrong. So with that, I'm going to end this with a part that I wrote from a paper here recently. And it goes as this: history/culture is written by those with the words to keep the stories permanent. If the cultural practices are not taught or done, the stories are never told, never public, and never known. It is as if they, the people that these stories are about, would never have existed. The great fear of the great death of colonialization is the ultimate destruction of ethnic indigenous culture. But let us consider the consequences of assimilation. Moreover, assimilation suggests that the acceptance of subjugation under hegemonic rule. Once again, for hegemony to succeed, it requires the suppression, assimilation, and destruction of the original cultures to fit within the needs of the collective. Yes, the risk of like a Borg-like human utopia is the loss of the unique, the interesting, and the beautiful individuality. However, it is our differences that make us unique, interesting, and beautiful. So we who are navigating this lost sense of indigenous ethnic identity must make certain to acquiesce in certain parts. One must accept that without colonialism, we would not have the privilege to sit here and debate about it, be resentful, and yearn for the ancestral birthright that was forcibly removed. We must accept that there is no going back, and if we could go back in time, how far would we go? Thus, the only way to move forward is forward. A concept that is paramount for trauma recovery is gratitude, is a gratitude practice that requires one to acknowledge the past, be present enough to make that acknowledgement, and chart a path moving forward. If one constantly looks in the rearview mirror, and this is the case with trauma healing overall, if one is stuck looking in the rearview mirror, they are robbed of the present and have no opportunity to chart a path forward. This is especially true if the lens through which one looks into in the past is muddied and broken, and the vision is distorted by anger, resentment, and fear. So I will continue doing this podcast as I do. Some of you may disagree with me. Some of you may dislike me. That's fine. Turn the channel. But if you have issues with me, address me and I'll have a conversation with you. But if you choose to turn those conversations and twist my words and mischaracterize me and insinuate or just accuse me incorrectly, we'll have further conversation and I will set the record straight. I didn't want to have to do this today. I did not want to waste my time on this, but here we are. Anyways, have a good day. I have other podcasts coming up here later on this week. But yeah, have a good day.